Professor Lessing, your response to my last question was really interesting and valuable. Please say more about the structure of Deuteronomy.
Joshua, let's look again at this idea of a Hittite treaty formula. You can see on the slide, to reiterate, it's a formula, a covenant made between a suzerain and a vassal, a greater and a lesser person. And there you have the 6 parts that are presented again for you, from preamble to historical prologue, stipulations, preservation and rereading, witnesses, blessings, and curses. Having understood that, let's take a look at how the rest of the Old Testament is going to respond to this 6-part idea. As I mentioned in the answer to the last question, what the prophets do, and by prophets I mean the classical writing prophets, beginning with Amos in the 8th century and going all the way to Malachi, probably in the early 5th century BC. But to a person, these writing prophets look at this 6-part treaty covenant, and they call into question Israel's response to what God had done for them. In essence, the prophets tell us that God is displeased with Israel because they followed other gods. They hooked up and made treaties with different gods, thus breaking this covenant that is reiterated in the book of Deuteronomy. So what happens? In essence, what the prophets say to Israel is, without repentance, without returning to the God who loves them and embraces them and had carried them on eagle's wings to himself in making this treaty and covenant at Mount Sinai, apart from returning to him, the blessings and the curses will be enacted. And as we see the 6th part of this treaty, we're going to notice that understanding this will help us get a grip on what happened in 721 BC when Shalmaneser V and Sargon II, these Assyrian kings, came in, laid siege to the capital of the north, Samaria, for 3 years, and it finally fell. The people were kicked out of the land. They were exiled. Why did this happen? Because this is the structure of Deuteronomy. This is how God is going to involve himself with his people Israel. And this is what the prophets warned again and again and again. Amos warns them of exile. Micah warns them of exile. Hosea warns them of exile. Isaiah warns the north of exile. But they didn't listen to the prophetic call to return to the God who made covenants with them at Sinai. In 586, the same curse is going to happen as Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and others warned the people to return to the Lord their God. Refusing to listen to the prophetic voice, God finally used the Babylonians, not the Assyrians this time, as he did in the 8th century, but in the 6th century BC, the Babylonians came under King Nebuchadnezzar and his chief butcher Nebuzaradan, and the people were exiled from the land. I want you to understand as you continue to look at this slide that this Hittite treaty and these 6 parts are going to perform for us a keen insight into the rest of the history of the Old Testament. The big question is, how long will they stay in the lands? And then the pressing question becomes, once the north receives the curse in 721, once the south receives the curse in 586, what's going to happen? Where is there going to be a future and hope for the promised seed of Genesis 3:15 and the promise made to Abraham in chapters 12 and 15 and 17 in the book of Genesis? Well, let's not answer that question right now. Let's move on in our journey toward the Old Testament, keeping in mind the structure of the book of Deuteronomy and how these 6 parts are going to help us understand Israel's future with her Lord.